Hi. Can I ask you to elaborate on one thing you touched on very briefly? You mentioned something about torture, I think was your word. If you get to the stage where you can love someone who chops down trees, if that is what you're against, if someone is physically or mentally torturing you, is it against your own love for yourself and your body not to stand up against that?
There's a difference between standing up for something and actually being and actually then projecting violence back. As soon as you make the step of being violent in return, then basically you are choosing to become like them. And in the process of choosing to become like them, you are now stepped out of God's laws and into your own self-reliance. And in that place, you are not in a loving place. So yes, what I'm actually saying is that you'll get to a place where you can personally be tortured and still love the person who's torturing you. And
whether it is mental or physical,
yep.
I guess is regardless, but that is the most loving thing that you can do for yourself and your soul, to accept that.
Well, I'm not saying you wouldn't try to get out of the situation, but you wouldn't use violent means to try to get out of the situation. So yes, you could try to reason yourself out of the situation, and if you had the option of leaving, you would certainly leave. But if you didn't have the option of leaving, and you didn't have the option of anything other than violence, you wouldn't choose violence in order to get out of the situation. Because in choosing violence, all you do is become the perpetrator of violence. And this is a big thing on the earth today, is we feel there is such a thing as justified violence, and there isn't. As soon as you start justifying violence, you start justifying war, and you start justifying all sorts of things after that. And it's our desire to justify violence that causes us to, in the end, become violent. And what we need to realise is what we need to justify is love. So we need to look at, all right, there's a very good reason for me to stay in this place where I'm not violent, no matter how much violence is perpetrated against myself. The powerful reason is I can change things that way. And if you have a look at people in history who have attempted this on a wider scale than just one person, Gandhi is one of those people. So I don't know if you've ever seen the movie about Gandhi's life or have read much about Gandhi, but Gandhi was a believer in non-violent protest. So in other words, what he would do, and there's a lovely scene in his movie where he's in South Africa, and they protested against apartheid in South Africa, and in particular the way in which they'd use Indian people in different jobs. And what many of the people who were supporting Gandhi at the time decided to do was they decided to just not do the job. And they would go to work and not do the job. So they'd go there and they'd just sit there or stand there. Now, many of them got beaten senseless in the process, but after about 2 or 3 days of getting beaten, the whole world was in an outcry about the violence that was being perpetrated towards people who weren't retaliating. You see, as soon as you retaliate, now there's a justification. But if you don't ever retaliate, how can anybody justify their continual violence towards you? They can't, in the end. And sooner or later, enough people on the planet will notice it and will actually step out of this place of feeling that violence is justified and into the place where they feel that violence isn't justified, particularly towards people who are not violent in return. And the beauty of getting into that place is you can change things very rapidly. So Gandhi, in his own course of his own life, changed many things very rapidly as a result of his desire to have this non-violent protest in his own life. And that was even without connecting with God and without connecting to other things, although Gandhi himself was connected with God. Many of the people who applied his principles were not. But they still accomplished great things by not justifying violence anymore.
I guess my question sort of stems more on a one-on-one basis. I guess personally, something that I have no direct knowledge or experience of, but I have a lot of close friends, and not to mention an unsavoury topic, but a lot of female friends who've gone through something traumatic like rape. And what comfort can you give them other than, well, when you're in a position around other people, try and put some procedures in place, but when it comes a one-on-one confrontation, to just accept it and to live with that.
I'm not saying that they have to accept it, What I'm saying is there are emotions within them. In the case of a rape, for example, there are emotions they will definitely feel. Like if you're being attacked on any level, whether it be violently physically or violently sexually, you're going to have emotions to feel. If you believe that you cannot cope with those emotions, that's when you'll retaliate with the same kind of violence. If you believe inside of yourself and you know that you can cope with anything that's thrown at you, including physical violence or rape or any of these other things, and you know that all you need to do is feel your emotions to release it, then you can get through it without retaliating violently. But secondly, in all of these different things, we ask these questions living from a point of self-reliance. You see, we don't look at the fact that there is reasons why we attract events as well. So, for example, if someone's violent towards me, there's something inside of me that's attracting this violence as well, right? And I need to look at what's inside of me. And the only person I can change is me. So I can only change my fear of the violence, if you like. Now, ironically, when I change my fear of the violence, I will have less violence perpetrated against me, because the law of attraction is in operation at all times, which means that actually when I'm afraid of violence, there's a higher likelihood of violence occurring towards myself. When I'm less afraid of violence, there is a less chance of violence occurring towards myself. Now, it doesn't mean it might not happen. It just means there's a less chance. But if I also have the belief that anything that's thrown at me, I can emotionally handle, and I know that I can handle all of my own emotions because I know I'm connected with God and I've got God's help through every emotion, then I'm not worried about what's going to happen to me, ever. And this is the state all of us can live in, where we're no longer afraid of what can happen to us. And when we're no longer afraid of what can happen to us, we no longer perpetrate acts of violence towards others in deference to fear. Because what finishes up happening, if you think about it, remember I said right at the beginning here with this diagram that our fear is something we need to focus on. If I live in my fear, eventually I will justify becoming violent to someone else. Now, to give you an example on a global scale, the US government has justified preemptive violence on the basis that the other person might do it to them. So what we finish up doing is we start justifying preemptive violence. We actually start justifying being violent to someone else before they're even violent to us in order to prevent their violence to us. And that is just all an act of fear in the end. It's all about perpetrating and deepening our own fears. You see, when we're connected with God, we know we can actually experience every single thing, including torture, rape, abuse, all sorts of things. We can experience all of those things, and we can come out of every one of them. And we know we can come out of them in a pristine state, actually, once we're in this state where we're fully connected with God. The irony is, when we're fully connected with God, the likelihood of these events occurring are also much less because we're not attracting them into our lives due to our fear. So we have positive effects either way if we choose to not act in violence in any situation. Now, that being said, in the case of someone like rape, there are often many things at play. Many people get themselves into dangerous situations because of choices they make that if they were more connected with their own emotions at the time, they wouldn't have made that choice. So, for example, many rapes occur under the influence of alcohol. Why is that? Because if the woman didn't have the drink, often they would be more sensitive to the sexually violent men around them, that when they have the drink, they're less sensitive to it because they're less connected with their own emotion. So when I walk into a room, I can feel every sexually violent man in the room, right? Now, a woman in that place, if they walk into the room, could feel every sexually violent man in the room, she would go, wow, this is not a very good place to be. Straight away, she'd feel that inside of herself if she was sensitive to that emotionally. So would she remain there? And would she go in there and have a drink with one of them? Probably not. Now, I'm not saying that she's to blame for the rape, but what I'm saying is that there's a whole law of attraction of events that occurred to place the person in the situation where they're harmed. And often we are not looking at the choices we make getting to the place. We just look at the event and we say, oh, the person's to blame for the event, or the person who raped was to blame for the event, which of course they are, but that's not looking at why was I sitting next to them in the train? What was going on there for me? What series of choices did I make to get to that place? And often when we look at that, we see all sorts of emotional injuries as to why I chose to be sitting next to this person that I couldn't feel could potentially rape me. Does that make sense? When you're in really tune with your own emotion, you will feel the people who could easily harm you, and you won't choose to be in their company.
In that unlikely situation where a hypothetical attack is fatal, how does that person, that soul, then deal with that? They're dead, but how does that person process that?
Well, there is no difference between processing it when we're living here on the earth as there is in the spirit world. So the truth is, you will enter into the spirit world with exactly the same emotions as what you left here. And the exactly same capacity to deal with those emotions as what you had before you left. So the answer is identical to the answer as if they stayed alive, in that they only have to do with one extra thing, and that is that they've passed. And to be frank with you, I don't feel passing is a very big event in comparison to what most people feel it. Passing is just a part that every one of us will have to do at some point, whether it's before so-called our time or after our time is what we often call it. And every one of us will pass at some point. Every one of us will pass with the same capacity to experience emotion, the same intellectual capacity as what we have right now, and the same belief systems and the same moral systems that we have right now. And we have the same capacity to deal with everything there as we do now here. So there is no difference in dealing with it when you pass or not. And in fact, many of the people who pass, after a very, very short time after their passing, would never opt to come back to their earth life. So while we stay so attached to our earth life, many people who pass after a few months, and many times even just after a few days, would far more prefer to be in the spirit world than they would prefer to be here. You see, the problem is that many of us have such a dim knowledge of the spirit world itself that we have so much fear associated with going there. But if we had a far wider knowledge of the spirit world, you would have far less fear about going there. In fact, many of you would start looking forward to it rather than being so afraid of it as a result.